Thomas Sankara once said, "You cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness." In this case, it comes from nonconformity. The courage to turn your back on the old formulas. The courage to invent the future. It took the madmen of yesterday for us to be able to act with extreme clarity today. I want to be one of those madmen. We must dare to invent the future. Okay, as you've gathered from the title, today's video is going to be about the history of racism against Black Americans. This is the second part to the series. It will cover the Civil War. If you haven't watched the first part, I suggest you do. White people can face discrimination, stereotyping, or prejudice. However, they cannot and do not face systemic oppression. I wanted to point this out as many people do not see the need for the second half of this definition. Many people will say, if you truly care about racism, then shouldn't you treat all discrimination equally? This is a nonsensical argument. You cannot treat all discrimination equally when there isn't even equality yet. There are no sundown towns for white people. There are no systemic lynchings of white people. There is no disproportionate killing of white people by the police. There is no mass incarceration of white people due to skin color. There is no systemic voter oppression affecting white people due to skin color. There is no mass displacement of white people due to skin color. There is no forced sterilization of white people due to skin color. I am not saying white people cannot face discrimination. However, they by definition and by real-life metrics cannot face racism. But it's not particularly necessary. First disclaimer, I am a cis Cuban-American white woman. I am sadly from Florida. My mother is white and was born and raised in Cuba. My father is biracial, part black, part white, and also born and raised in Cuba. I cannot talk about the topic of racism as if it has ever directly affected me. I am very white passing and live in a predominantly Hispanic community where I've been pretty sheltered from xenophobia or overt racism directed at me or my family. Second disclaimer, all the topics discussed on my channel going forward, I do heavily research. Below I will be linking all sources as well as other valuable information like petitions or organizations you can donate to. Third disclaimer, although this will be very informative and majorly history, I will be giving my opinion and be biased. If this will make you upset, don't watch the video. Final and most important disclaimer, we will be talking about slavery, racism, race-motivated violence, and SA. If any of these topics trigger you or make you uncomfortable, please click away. Lincoln's election in 1860 caused widespread outrage in the South, as you know, conservatives hate free and fair elections, leading to Southern secession. I want to make this clear. The Civil War was because of slavery. Many Southerners love to say it was because of states' rights. However, even if you entertain that idea, it was states' rights for individuals to own slaves, making the core issue slavery. The reality is that the reason slavery existed in nearly every Southern state is because the population wanted it to. Slavery up until the 1840s was a state's issue and did not unilaterally apply to all of America. Stephen Douglas was right when he said that slavery could not survive in a territory without the support of the population. Whether it be economic motivations, racist motivations, or a combo of both is a different conversation. In an economic standpoint, slavery was overwhelmingly positive for Southern plantation owners. It has been estimated that had emancipation not happened, by 1890, an average slave would have yielded his owner a net marginal product 52% higher than 1860, and the market price for ownership would have increased accordingly. The market value of slaves in the United States in 1860 equaled about $2.7 billion. Slavery was both morally abhorrent and economically profitable for land-owning white men, the stakeholders of this country. There has been much discourse as to whether the Civil War should be classified as total war. Total war is defined as, quote, a war that is unrestricted in terms of the weapons used, the territory or combatants involved, or the objectives pursued. Some historians credit Union soldiers with not distinguishing between civilians and troops, as well as R-wording and pillaging towns, causing immense property damage. Many of these claims have been discredited, and the Civil War did not bring economic devastation to the South via property damage. Instead, it targeted individual Southerners. In per capita terms, the average total wealth of all Southern farmers dropped from $22,819 in 1860 to $3,168 a decade later. Something that often happens when discussing the Civil War and Black history in general is pitting the North and South against each other. Yes, slavery was prevalent in the South, and yes, they rebelled, causing the Civil War. However, it must be acknowledged that the North was also culpable in the issue. The North played a role in the spread of slavery as an institution and in allowing it to become pervasive. Even after the end of slavery and entering Reconstruction, we will see how the North not only idly stands by while the South consistently violates Black Americans' rights, it joins in on these violations. Although the North is painted as the lesser of two evils, one could argue their motivation for freeing Black Americans was so poor Northern whites could stop competing against Black slaves and get a leg up in the economy. There is also the telling of the brave Republicans who saved Black Americans and the nasty Democrats who vilified them at every turn. While it is true that Republicans passed laws benefiting Black Americans, they did little to enforce them, rendering these laws ineffective. The Civil War today might be taught as a quest for liberation, but the reality is the Civil War fought then was a bloody, brutal, visionless war with the unintended byproduct of emancipation. Party lines might be important in the telling of history, but one must not be fooled into believing that one party truly worked in favor of Black Americans, as ultimately both benefited from their subjugation and both benefited in their disenfranchisement, something still true today. Something you will notice is that in this period, we had progressive Republicans and conservative Democrats. Something many people get stuck on is the political party rather than political ideology. The political ideologies and views of parties can change or even swap with time. At this time, Republicans were the progressives and Democrats were the conservatives until eventually the parties realigned. Political realignment is defined as a rare, significant, long-term change in the voting behavior and party identification of the electorate, or the citizens eligible to vote. In the months following Lincoln's election, new patrol groups and Minutemen volunteer organizations sprang up across the South. The groups served multiple purposes, like augmenting local surveillance of suspicious whites and assisting slave patrols with their increasingly important duties. These groups, aside from helping patrollers, distributed propaganda about what the appropriate response to Lincoln's election should be: secession. With a cry for quote-unquote states' rights, South Carolina left the Union, continuing with Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, aka the 7 states with the highest estimated economic stake in slavery. On February 4, 1861, delegates from the states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and the Confederacy was born. Just to illustrate that the core issue of the Civil War is slavery, the Confederacy created their own constitution, which was almost identical to our own. But a notable difference was that the Confederate Constitution, quote, protected and recognized slavery in the new territories. Furthermore, in their secession documents, Mississippi, Texas, and South Carolina each said slavery was their reason for leaving the Union. Historians have found it was only after the war, when slavery was abolished, that Southerners began listing states' rights as a cause for the Civil War. Then, on February 9th, the delegates unanimously elected former Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis as president and Georgian Alexander Stephens as vice president. In his March 21, 1861 cornerstone speech, Confederate VP Alexander Stephens said, quote, "Upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition." In April 1861, the borders of Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina joined the Confederacy. Something I want to point out: Abraham Lincoln did not start the Civil War because he wanted to abolish slavery. He cared about the issue, but he did not believe the federal government had the power to abolish slavery where it already existed. Many like to paint Abraham Lincoln as someone righteous. However, Lincoln started the Civil War because he didn't want to go down in history as the president that couldn't preserve the Union. Although with time he knew he did the right thing, he didn't go into the war with abolishing slavery as his prime goal. Lincoln said, quote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery." When the Civil War started, the Union had many advantages, being more fighting power, more factories, greater food production, and a more extensive railroad system. The South also had some advantages, being cotton and its profits and first-rate generals. The Union devised a three-part plan known as the Anaconda Plan. First, they would blockade the southern ports, so the South could neither export cotton nor import manufactured goods. Second, Union riverboats and armies would move down the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy into two. Lastly, Union armies would capture the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia. When the war began, many free black men up north wanted to fight for the Union. Frederick Douglass at the time stated, quote, "We are ready and would go." Prejudice, however, against black Americans was strong in the North and South. Most white Americans believed black adults had the same mental capacity as children, lacking in mental ability and discipline. Stereotypes led the majority of white Americans to assume that black men could never be trained to fight like a white soldier. The onset of war caused Southern whites to become paranoid of black uprising, causing them to, in some states, double their slave patrols in 1861. Ultimately, with the increasing need for men in the war, with time, many states were low on able-bodied men available to take up patrol duties. There were many battles fought in the Civil War, however, I will only be discussing 5 battles and the surrender. At the start of the war, Lincoln, Congress, and most Northerners first referred to a civil war or an insurrection, but quickly called it the Rebellion, a name they hoped would boost the goal of preserving the Union. Frederick Douglass and others proposed Abolition War or the Slaveholders' Rebellion as alternatives, putting slavery at the front of the war. However, few Northerners adopted them. Northerners continued to call it the Rebellion the first few decades after the war, but Southerners objected. Instead, they called it the Civil War or the War Between the States. By the end of the century, Civil War was the common public name, and Congress, between 1905 and 1911, made it the official name of the war. On July 21st, 1861, about 3 months after Fort Sumner fell, Fort Sumner being the first shots fired in the war, Union General Irving McDowell marched out of Washington, D.C. into Virginia with the hope of seizing the Confederate capital of Richmond, only 100 miles from D.C. Most of McDowell's army were inexperienced, however, so were the Confederates. Lincoln even noting, quote, "You are green, it is true, but they are green also." In the morning, the Union gained the upper hand, but reinforcements soon arrived for the Confederates. The Confederates held firm, led by General Thomas J. Jackson, who earned the nickname Stonewall Jackson as he was standing like a stone wall. The Union ended up retreating, but the Confederate soldiers did not pursue as they were too exhausted and disorganized to attack Washington. The Union suffered 2,896 casualties, while the Confederates suffered 1,982 casualties. In 1861, writing under a pseudonym, former slave and abolitionist Harriet Jacobs recounted her master's sexual power over her in incidents in the life of a slave girl. She also spoke of the young male slave Luke, who was implied to have been S.A.'d on the plantation. One of my favorite quotes from the book was, "Women are considered of no value unless they continually increase their owner's stock. They are put on par with animals." This same master shot a woman through the head, who had run away and been brought back to him. No one called him to account for it. If a slave resisted being whipped, the bloodhounds were unpacked and set upon him, to tear his flesh from his bones. The master who did these things was highly educated, and styled a perfect gentleman. He also boasted the name and standing of a Christian, though Satan never had a truer follower. In February 1862, Ulysses S. Grant captured Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, located near Cumberland River in Tennessee. The Confederates planned a counterattack against Union troops. When they seemed to be succeeding, they halted and retreated. Grant, in the midst of their retreat, found their weak point and attacked it. Grant informed the Confederate generals Gideon Pillow and John B. Floyd, quote, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." This in turn earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender. The Union suffered 2,832 casualties, while the Confederates suffered 1,400 to 2,000 plus. When the Union began to invade the South in 1861, Black Americans responded with a general strike, as coined by W.E.B. Du Bois, leading Congress to pass the Militia Act of 1862 in July 1862, which permitted black men to enlist at a pay rate of $10 per month. However, Congress left it up to Lincoln to determine their duties. Lincoln decided that any black men enlisting were to be only laborers and not combat soldiers. As the war pressed on and the casualties rose, Lincoln began understanding that military necessity might force him to abolish slavery to bring black Southerners to the Union side. Also in July 1862, congressional policy approved by Lincoln stated property confiscated during the war under the Confiscation Act of July 1862 would revert to the heirs of the Confederate owners. On August 29th and 30th, 1862, Robert E. Lee, a Confederate general, won at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Lee and his army invaded Maryland to knock back the Union. General George McClellan and his army were sent to the Potomac to stop them. McClellan got lucky. A Union corporal exploring a meadow where the Confederates camped stumbled on a copy of Lee's army orders wrapped around a bunch of cigars. The plan revealed Stonewall Jackson and Lee's armies were separated for the moment. McClellan moved aggressively towards Lee's army and the two forces collided in a cornfield in Sharpsburg, Maryland. They eventually shifted to a stone bridge along a sluggish creek called the Antietam. The clash proved to be the bloodiest single-day battle in all American history. The battle ended in a stalemate, with McClellan being cautious instead of pursuing forward and possibly ending the war. The South ultimately retreated the next day across the Potomac into Virginia. The Union suffered 12,401 casualties, while the Confederacy suffered 10,138. After the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln fired McClellan for having, quote, the slows. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln, feeling pressured by the abolitionists, passed the Emancipation Proclamation. This did not free all slaves. It instead only freed slaves behind Confederate lines, outside Union control, meaning it didn't apply to Southern slave states that had not seceded. This allowed states like Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri to have their cake and eat it too. They all remained in the Union, however, still contributed volunteers to the Confederacy, and furthermore kept slavery intact at the time. After the proclamation, compromise was no longer a viable option. The Confederacy knew that if they lost, slavery would end. As the casualties grew, the volunteers to the Army decreased, forcing conscription, or the draft, on both sides. The Confederacy passed a draft in 1862, drafting all able-bodied white men aged between 18 to 35, and the Unions followed suit in 1863, drafting all able-bodied white men between 20 and 45. With mobilization and many men volunteering for military service, the numbers of men available to patrol became uncertain. Incidentally, efforts to strengthen patrols came at the moment Army service depleted the numbers of eligible males, including many who had previously performed patrol duty. On July 1, 1863, Confederate soldiers led by A.P. Hills went to Gettysburg to find a rumored supply of footwear and meet General Lee's forces. They ended up colliding with a couple of brigades of Union cavalry led by John Buford. The Union took defensive positions on the hills, and ultimately, the Confederates took control of the town. On the second day of the battle, General Lee failed to break through Union lines. It came to a close on July 3rd when Lee ordered an artillery brigade in the middle of Union lines. Confederate General George Pickett led two brigades in an assault to the Union position, later known as Pickett's Charge. This assault turned into a disaster, forcing Lee to retreat and abandon his invasion. The Union suffered 23,000 plus casualties, while the Confederacy suffered 28,000 plus casualties. In 1863, the Confederate Congress threatened to punish black troops and enslave black soldiers. In response to this, Lincoln issued General Order 233, threatening reprisal on Confederate prisoners of war for any mistreatment of black troops. Although the threat restrained Confederates, black prisoners were still commonly treated harsher than white prisoners. For example, Confederate soldiers shot to death black Union soldiers captured at the Fort Pillow, Tennessee engagement of 1864. Confederate General Forrest witnessed this massacre and did nothing to prevent it. On July 13 to 16, 1863, in New York City, poor white workers thought it unfair that they should fight a war to free the slaves. They felt that free black men would steal their jobs. Once draft names began to be drawn, white mobs rampaged through the city. The rioters destroyed draft offices, Republican newspaper offices, and homes of anti-slavery leaders. They attacked well-dressed men on the street and black civilians. In December 1863, Lincoln announced the 10% Plan. Lincoln believed the state's secession did not hold ground. Since the Constitution does not have any clauses on secession, he believed the states never truly left the Union and only individuals should be punished. Lincoln would pardon all Confederates except high-ranking officials and prisoners of war. Those pardoned would swear allegiance to the Union. After 10% of those on the 1860 voting lists took the oath of allegiance, a Confederate state could form a new state government and gain representation in Congress. This plan angered many radical Republicans in Congress as they believed it was far too lenient. After General William T. Sherman occupied the Transportation Center of Atlanta on September 2, 1864, a Confederate army tried to cut off his railroad supply lines. Sherman decided to instead abandon his supply lines and march towards Georgia. Sherman's strategy was to burn and destroy everything in sight. He wanted to make Southerners, quote, so sick of war that generations would pass away before they would again appeal to it. In mid-November, he burned most of Atlanta. The capture of Atlanta hindered Confederate war efforts and lifted Lincoln in the polls before the 1864 election. The Union suffered 31,700 casualties, while the Confederacy suffered 34,900. In the election of 1864, Lincoln was running against Democrat nominee George McClellan, or the General with the Slows, and radical Republican John C. Fremont. Lincoln's chances of winning re-election were slim. He himself was pessimistic, stating, quote, I am going to be beaten, and unless some great change takes place, badly beaten. Ultimately, with the shutting down of a major Southern port in August and the win in Atlanta in September, Lincoln pulled through, winning a second term with Democrat Andrew Johnson as his VP. During the war, hundreds of thousands of Black Americans sought freedom and refuge with Union troops. During this time, Union generals would welcome and help runaway slaves. Unfortunately, due to the large number of runaways, most couldn't be helped, and most remained homeless. Organizations were created to ease the general situation of homelessness and poverty. For example, Chaplain George Eaton, on orders from General Grant, took control of all unemployed and homeless fugitives within Union lines. Eaton opened a camp in Grand Junction and put the runaway slaves to work at picking, ginning, and baling all cotton now outstanding in the fields. Grant provided Eaton with money and supplies to build shelter and supply food to the homeless Black workers in the camp. These camps spread throughout Union lines as the work provided began to help not only the federal government, but private citizens. Sadly, only a fraction of those seeking help could be accommodated. Even those fortunate to receive payment could still have been homeless due to the transient nature of the work. Most used payment to feed their families who trailed the workers wherever they were sent. During the war, Black troops were often assigned tough, dirty jobs like digging trenches. Although many served in the infantry and artillery, discrimination resulted in large numbers of Black soldiers being assigned to non-combat support duties like cooks, laborers, and teamsters. Black women who couldn't formally join the army served as nurses, spies, and scouts, the most famous being Harriet Tubman, who scouted for the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. In 1863, Tubman became the first and only woman to lead a military expedition during the Civil War. She led 150 soldiers on 3 federal gunboats up South Carolina's Combahee River for a surprise attack on the plantations of prominent secessionists. Along the route, they stopped at several spots to rescue more than 700 slaves. Black regiments were majorly issued inferior equipment and sometimes given inadequate medical treatment in segregated hospitals. Black soldiers were initially paid $10 per month, from which $3 was automatically deducted for clothing. In contrast, white soldiers received $13 per month, from which no clothing allowance was drawn. Some Black units, like the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, refused to accept pay if it remained unequal. In June 1864, Congress granted equal pay to the United States colored troops. Also, off-duty Black soldiers were often attacked in northern cities, such as Zanesville, Ohio. For example, in February 1864, cries were heard to, quote, kill the N-word. Few Black soldiers were commissioned as officers, and Black troops remained in segregated units throughout the Civil War. In fact, Black troops were not integrated with their fellow Americans until the Korean War, nearly 100 years later. Despite the inequality, black soldiers, including more than a dozen Congressional Medal of Honor winners, fought in 449 Civil War battles. There were about 200,000 black men who joined the Army and Navy, and about 38,000 died. Historian James McPherson says, quote, "Without their help, the North could not have won the war as soon as it did, and perhaps it could not have won at all." The Civil War came to a close on April 9, 1865, when Confederate General Lee surrendered in a Virginia village called Appomattox Courthouse. Approximately 360,000 Union soldiers and 260,000 Confederate soldiers died. The war also heavily strained the economy, with the federal government spending about $3.3 billion between the Union and Confederacy combined during the 4 years of the war. The 13th Amendment was introduced into the House in January 1865 and ratified by the end of the year, stating, quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." The wording will be important in a later video. On April 14, 1865, 4 days after Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth in his seat at Ford Theater and died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th. I want to end the video by saying that we must move forward. Oftentimes when discussing the future of America, many ponder what the founders would want us to do. I don't care what the founders would think. None of us should be asking what the men who wrote a document preaching freedom, yet justifying slavery, would think about our path today. While the founders in our past is important, and we must always remember them, we cannot get lost in them. Time moves forward, and as a country, we must remember the past to realize it cannot become our future. So we must turn our backs on the old formulas and strive to invent the future. In the next video, we'll be talking about Reconstruction. See you then. Don't forget to like and subscribe before you leave. If you have nothing nice to say, keep it to yourself, because I would hate to have to roast you in the comments. Thanks for listening.